Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back to a time when being born royal didn't mean you lived well. It mostly meant you had to sit still while people painted you, married your cousin, and died of gout at 34. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, put the phone away for a while, and let's glide slowly through the weird, slightly tragic, and very unrelatable world of medieval royalty. Picture this. You're a 13th century prince. You wake up in a cold stone room that smells like smoke and damp wool. Someone's trying to feed you ale for breakfast because apparently water isn't safe. Your father, the king, is probably at war. Your mother is having her 12th child. And your main job? To look noble while your tutor explains Latin verbs you'll never actually use. Ah, medieval luxury. Royal life back then wasn't quite the velvet dream we imagine from modern TV shows. Sure, there were jewels and banquets in huge castles, but there were also lice combs, bad teeth, and arranged marriages that read like medical experiments. And everyone was somehow related. Let's start with that actually, the royal family tree, or more accurately, the royal family knot. Because by the 1200s, every noble house in Europe was basically one big awkward dinner party of distant cousins pretending they weren't cousins. Take the Habsburgs, for instance, the ultimate overachievers in marrying themselves. Their motto might as well have been, "Why meet new people when you can marry the same face again?" Now, we'll get to their jaw problem later, but for now, imagine living in a world where your parents' marriage was decided before you were even born, where treaties were signed over your future spouse while you were still teething. The royal motto wasn't "follow your heart," it was more like "follow the alliance." And love, that was cute, but mostly irrelevant. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the rare medieval queens who managed to be powerful and interesting without being burned at the stake. She was married first to Louis VII of France, a man so pious he made a monk look wild. Eleanor, on the other hand, liked music, poetry, and crusades. The marriage went about as well as you'd expect. They spent their honeymoon arguing on the way to Jerusalem, and it ended in annulment because, allegedly, they were too closely related. Which is hilarious, because everyone was too closely related. But sure, that was the official excuse. Within months, she remarried Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England, who was fiery, ambitious, and, let's say, not exactly a husband of the year. They fought constantly, had 8 children, and at one point Eleanor literally helped her sons rebel against him. A solid family dynamic. But here's the weird part. Despite all the scheming, the power plays, and the occasional imprisonment, Henry did lock her up for about 15 years. Eleanor outlived almost everyone. She lived to be around 80, which in medieval royal years is basically immortal. Let's float over to the general vibe of a royal court around this time. If you were a noble, your daily life was a mix of ceremony, prayer, and pure boredom. Most royals didn't work in the modern sense. They just existed, which meant endless feasts, gossip, and rituals that made no sense but were apparently very important. For example, the king's dinner might involve 20 courses, all served in a specific order, while a servant stood by just to hold his napkin. The food itself, think roasted peacock, swan, and something called meat jelly, because nothing says luxury like lukewarm animal gelatin. Hygiene, meanwhile, was optional. Medieval people did bathe, just not often. A royal might take a bath for special occasions, like a coronation, a wedding, or after losing a war. But they did use perfumes, herbs, and scented gloves to cover up the smell. If you ever wondered why medieval portraits look so serious, it's probably because they were trying not to breathe through their nose. And let's not forget medicine. Royal doctors were basically early practitioners of guesswork. If you got sick, they might bleed you to balance your humours, give you crushed emeralds as a tonic, or recommend you pray harder, which honestly might have been the safest treatment option. One famous case was King Charles VI of France, known affectionately as Charles the Mad. He started off as a promising ruler, young, handsome, charming. Then, one day, he just snapped. He attacked his own knights in the forest, claiming they were traitors, and spent the rest of his life convinced he was made of glass. He would sit completely still for hours, terrified someone might bump into him and shatter his body. Did his doctors help? Not really. They tried baths, herbs, and holy water. The usual spa day, but for psychosis. The royal court tried to pretend everything was fine, which, in fairness, was the standard royal coping mechanism. If a king lost his mind, everyone just quietly adjusted the narrative. Oh no, he's not crazy, he's just deeply contemplative. Meanwhile, politics marched on. And if the king couldn't rule, his relatives, usually ambitious uncles, were more than happy to step in. Now, for the ladies of the court, life was a special kind of performance. Queens and princesses had to be pious, beautiful, and preferably fertile. Their main job was to produce heirs and not embarrass the dynasty. That was pretty much it. But some queens found ways to twist that script. Isabella of France, for example, known as the she-wolf of France, because medieval historians had a flair for drama, was married to Edward II of England. He was complicated. Let's just say he preferred the company of his male favourites over his wife, which didn't go unnoticed. Eventually, Isabella teamed up with her lover, invaded England, overthrew her husband, and became de facto ruler for a while, which sounds impressive, until her teenage son, Edward III, decided he'd had enough and staged a coup against her. Family dinners must have been awkward. But here's the thing. The medieval world genuinely believed in divine hierarchy. The king ruled because God said so, even if he was terrible at it, even if he was drooling on his crown. People didn't just accept it. They thought questioning it could damn their souls. That's what made medieval royalty so weirdly tragic. They had absolute power, but no real freedom. Everything they did was dictated by birth, duty, and superstition, and even when they tried to escape it, like Eleanor or Isabella, the cycle pulled them back in. Let's take a slow breath here. We're only scratching the surface of royal oddities. In the next stretch, we'll float into the stranger corners of royal health, diet, and the early science of looking important while falling apart. Because if there's one thing the medieval world excelled at, it was pretending everything was perfectly normal, even when absolutely nothing was. Part 2. The Weird Life of Royalty in Medieval Times. Boring history for sleep. Let's drift a little deeper into the royal mess, shall we? If there was one thing medieval royalty loved more than velvet robes and dramatic titles, it was pretending they were physically perfect. Beauty wasn't just vanity, it was proof that God liked you. And if you were ugly or sickly, well, that probably meant you'd sinned in a previous life or angered the wrong saint, which didn't age well for most of them. You see, centuries of intermarriage didn't just make the royal family tree look like a tangled ball of yarn. It also created a parade of medical oddities. The Habsburgs in particular became known for what can only be described as nature's cruel running joke, the Habsburg jaw. Now, the Habsburg jaw wasn't subtle. It was a massive, protruding chin paired with an underbite, so pronounced that one king, Charles II of Spain, could barely chew food. His face was practically a genealogical warning sign. Poor Charles II. He was the final product of 200 years of careful inbreeding, and, honestly, it showed. His family tree looked more like a straight line. He was sickly, infertile, and described by his own doctors as not entirely of this world, which, given how things were going for the Spanish Empire, was probably accurate. But here's the thing. None of this was considered weird at the time. In fact, marrying your cousin was practically a royal tradition. The logic was simple. Outsiders couldn't be trusted, so you kept the power and the DNA in the family. Of course, no one paused to ask whether that might be a bad long-term strategy. And so, for centuries, royal bloodlines became medical experiments. Generations of haemophilia, epilepsy, and mystery illnesses ran through the courts like family heirlooms. Queen Victoria famously passed haemophilia to several of her descendants, earning her the slightly grim nickname, the grandmother of Europe's bleeding disease. But let's pause the genetics lecture and talk about what these people actually did all day. Being a royal wasn't exactly a hands-on job. Most of them spent their mornings being dressed by attendants, because apparently putting on your own clothes was for peasants, followed by long sessions of public appearances. Think of it as the medieval version of Instagram. Everyone had to see you looking divine, even if you were slowly falling apart inside. And then there was the food. Oh, the food. Royal banquets were less about nourishment and more about flexing. The point wasn't to enjoy your meal. It was to show everyone how many animals you could afford to kill in one sitting. Peacocks, cranes, hedgehogs, even porpoises. If it moved, it could be roasted. The French kings in particular had a flair for excess. One banquet reportedly served over 1,000 dishes in a single evening. People didn't really eat them all, of course. They just stared at them in awe before the leftovers were given to servants, monks, or occasionally the family dogs. And yet, despite all that extravagance, nutrition wasn't great. Everything was drenched in salt, sugar, or exotic spices that had been hauled halfway across the world, just to prove you could afford them. Vegetables were for peasants, so were clean teeth. The result? By the time they hit 30, most royals were overweight, gout-ridden, and perpetually constipated. Henry VIII is the poster child for this lifestyle. He started as a tall, athletic young king, the kind you'd probably swipe right on. But by middle age, he could barely walk, his leg ulcers oozed constantly, and his doctors were too scared to tell him to stop eating roast goose. And yes, he blamed everyone else for it. But Henry wasn't unique. Across Europe, kings and queens were falling victim to their own indulgence. In a world where medicine consisted of drink mercury or rub garlic on it, small problems quickly became lifelong ailments. Royal doctors, meanwhile, were basically glorified guessers with fancy hats. They'd look at the patient, consult an astrological chart, and confidently announce that Mars was in retrograde. So the king needed a hot enema, and somehow that counted as healthcare. One royal favourite was bloodletting. The belief that most illnesses came from having too much blood. So if you caught a cold, they'd cut your arm open and let you bleed into a bowl. Logical, right? Some kings had this done regularly as a kind of medieval detox. Spoiler: it didn't work. Now, because health was considered a reflection of divine favour, kings who got sick had to maintain an illusion of perfection. So the court came up with ways to hide it. If a monarch had tremors, they'd be described as pious gestures. If they fainted, it was divine rapture. If they coughed up blood, the official statement was usually something like, "The king is in excellent spirits," the medieval version of PR spin. But let's not forget the royal obsession with looking the part. Appearance was everything. A pale complexion, delicate hands, and a certain divine glow were considered signs of nobility, which led to some truly questionable beauty routines. For instance, women would whiten their faces with mixtures containing lead or vinegar, which, shockingly, slowly poisoned them. Others plucked their hairlines back to achieve that fashionable, high forehead look, because nothing says royal grace like self-induced lead poisoning and baldness. Perfume was another necessity, partly because hygiene was a concept still in beta testing. Royals carried scented pomanders filled with herbs, ambergris, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges to block out the less pleasant odors of everyday life. Imagine an entire castle full of sweaty courtiers and damp fur cloaks. It's not hard to understand why everyone was obsessed with perfume. Even their clothes were designed for suffering. Layers upon layers of silk, velvet, and fur. Heavy, hot, and completely impractical. And since these garments had to display wealth, they were often lined with gold thread or jewels. It looked impressive, but it must have felt like wearing a sauna. And shoes. Let's just say comfort was not part of the plan. Men wore pointy shoes so long they had to be tied to their knees to keep from tripping. Women's dresses could weigh up to 30 pounds. Mobility was for peasants. Speaking of peasants, royals liked to think of themselves as a different species entirely. Medieval chroniclers described kings as semi-divine beings, part human, part chosen by God. Which sounds flattering until you realize it also meant their every move was under scrutiny. They couldn't sneeze without someone interpreting it as a sign from heaven. If a comet appeared, people assumed it was either a blessing for the king or a warning that he'd angered the saints again. Superstition ran deep. Royal astrologers were basically part of the cabinet. They decided when wars should start, when children should be conceived, and when the king should get a haircut. Even rational monarchs like Frederick II, who was unusually curious and scientific for his time, still consulted the stars before making decisions. Frederick, by the way, was a fascinating case. The man kept a literal zoo full of exotic animals, spoke 6 languages, and once tried to teach parrots Latin. He also performed some deeply questionable scientific experiments, like raising babies in total silence to see if they'd naturally start speaking Hebrew. Spoiler, they didn't. That's medieval science for you. But let's drift back to something softer. Royal childhood. Because honestly, it wasn't much of a childhood at all. Royal children were treated more like political assets than actual kids. From birth, they were assigned tutors, servants, and, of course, marriage contracts. By the age of 5, they were being groomed for diplomacy. By 12, they were probably married to someone they'd never met. Education focused on languages, religion, and manners, not happiness. Princes learned how to command armies and look stoic. Princesses learned how to smile politely and endure arranged marriages without crying in public. The irony is that many royals grew up incredibly lonely. Surrounded by servants but rarely shown affection, they learned early that love was secondary to duty, which explains why so many of them turned out emotionally unhinged. But even with all the dysfunction, there was a strange stability to it. The same rituals, the same etiquette, the same endless ceremonies. Everything in royal life was designed to maintain an illusion that these people were chosen by fate, untouchable and eternal. Of course, behind the tapestries and jeweled crowns, they were just as miserable, superstitious, and human as everyone else. So as you get comfortable, imagine drifting through a candlelit corridor somewhere in a 14th century palace. The air smells of incense and damp stone. You can hear distant music, the clink of goblets, and maybe someone arguing in Latin. This is what power looked like back then. Beautiful, strange, and slightly cursed. Part 3. The Weird Life of Royalty in Medieval Times. Boring history for sleep. Let's sink a little deeper into the velvet-scented chaos of royal love, because if there's one thing medieval monarchs were worse at than hygiene, it was marriage. Royal marriages weren't about love. They were about borders, alliances, and occasionally who had the best dowry. Picture a chessboard, but instead of pieces, you're moving around 12-year-olds in silk. The goal was to unite kingdoms, secure heirs, and hopefully avoid war. Though honestly, war still happened half the time. A king might wake up one morning and be told, "Congratulations, you're engaged to the Duke of Burgundy's niece." And he'd just nod and say, "Right, when do I meet her?" The answer was usually, "Never. She's in another country, but we sent your portrait." Of course, those portraits were like medieval Tinder filters. Artists were told to be flattering, to make the subject look appropriately holy, modest, and not too lumpy. So kings and queens often met their new spouses on the wedding day, only to realize that the painting was optimistic. One of the most famous examples of this was Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves. Henry had seen her portrait, painted by the very talented Hans Holbein, and thought she looked lovely, serene, composed, maybe a bit mysterious. Then she arrived in England, and Henry took one look at her and allegedly muttered, "I like her not," which, coming from Henry, a man who by that point was a swollen, ulcerated thundercloud of resentment, is rich still. The marriage went through for political reasons, lasted 6 months, and ended in a surprisingly amicable annulment. Anne walked away with a castle and a generous pension. Frankly, she got the best deal out of any of Henry's wives. Royal weddings themselves were spectacles. Whole cities celebrated, bells rang for days, but underneath all the pageantry, there was always tension. Would the union produce heirs? Because if not, everything fell apart. Medieval dynasties were obsessed with fertility. Producing a healthy son was considered divine validation. Producing a daughter? Well, that was fine, I guess. But 2 or 3 daughters in a row, and suddenly the king was blaming the queen for personal incompetence, as if she had any say in genetics. Poor Catherine of Aragon found this out the hard way. She had 6 pregnancies, but only 1 child survived, Mary Tudor. Henry VIII, ever the problem solver, decided the issue must be divine punishment and divorced her, because nothing screams holy man like blaming your wife for biology. Across Europe, the pressure to produce heirs turned bedrooms into political battlefields. If a royal couple couldn't have children, everyone got involved. Priests, doctors, and occasionally astrologers, who'd look at birth charts and solemnly announce that Mercury was making conception difficult this month. Privacy didn't exist. Some royal wedding nights were literally witnessed by attendants to confirm the marriage had been consummated. That's right. You couldn't even start your new life without an audience. And if things went poorly in the marital department, affairs were almost expected. Kings had mistresses, queens had companions, and everyone pretended it was fine as long as the line of succession stayed neat. Charles II of England, for example, had at least a dozen known mistresses and a whole football team of illegitimate children. None of them could inherit the throne, of course, but many of them received titles and estates. The royal family tree basically looked like a spider web by the end. But the weirdest part, people romanticized this chaos. Mistresses were often powerful, educated women who wielded influence behind the scenes. Some even shaped national politics. Take Madame de Pompadour, for instance, the mistress of Louis XV. She wasn't just a pretty face, she was an art patron, a diplomat, and one of the few people who could talk sense into the perpetually distracted king. Louis XV, meanwhile, spent most of his time either hunting, eating, or trying to find new ways to be entertained. The French court had turned boredom into an art form. They built pleasure palaces, hosted masked balls, and invented complicated card games just to pass the time. And that's the secret no one talks about. Royal life was often boring, crushingly, endlessly boring. You weren't free to travel or relax or go for a walk in town. Every moment was scripted, every conversation observed. Your friends were chosen for you. Your meals were planned. Even your sleep schedule depended on ritual. Kings had getting up and going to bed ceremonies with dozens of attendants watching them undress. It sounds awkward, but it was a way of reinforcing hierarchy, showing that even the most private act of a king was a public performance. Louis XIV, the Sun King, took this to theatrical extremes. Every morning, courtiers lined up to watch him wake up, hand him his wig, and pretend to be impressed while he stretched dramatically. He was the original influencer, except his followers wore powdered wigs and smelled faintly of lavender and decay. But Louis wasn't just vain, he was strategic. By turning his daily life into a ritual, he made sure the nobility stayed busy trying to please him instead of plotting rebellion. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was an elaborate social trap made of mirrors and etiquette. And the rules were brutal. Every gesture, every glance, every fold in your clothing could make or break your standing at court. If you handed the king his napkin incorrectly, your career was over. If you sneezed too loudly during mass, you might never recover socially. It was basically the Real Housewives of Versailles, but with powdered faces and mandatory Latin. Now, while all this was happening in France, over in England, the royal family had its own brand of weird. The Tudors were particularly theatrical about everything. Their marriages, their coronations, their feuds. Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth the Fair, turned royal image-making into a fine art. She styled herself as the Virgin Queen, married only to her country, which was probably the most strategic PR move in history. It let her dodge political marriages, keep her power, and turn personal loneliness into national mythology. Her portraits were deliberately designed to show her as ageless, flawless, almost divine. The reality, of course, was less glamorous. Her teeth were black from sugar, her wigs were heavy, and her temper was legendary. But no one dared mention that. In public, she was perfection. In private, she was human, tired, isolated, and constantly aware that her entire worth was tied to her image. This was the strange duality of medieval royalty. You had everything, but nothing belonged to you. Not your time, not your marriage, not even your emotions. You existed as a symbol, not a person. And yet for all the misery and melodrama, people still envied them. Peasants dreamed of silk sheets and golden goblets, unaware that the people sleeping in them were often just as miserable, only with fancier pillows. Let's float now to another side of royal weirdness. The religious rituals, superstitions, and mystical beliefs that guided their every move. Because if you thought astrology was odd, wait until you hear about the royal obsession with holy relics, miraculous cures, and prophetic dreams. Part 4. Superstition, Religion, and the Strange Beliefs of Medieval Royalty. Boring history for sleep so. Let's drift now into the quieter candlelit corners of medieval royal life. The parts filled with incense, whispers, and prayers muttered into the dark. Because if kings ruled with power, they also ruled with fear. Fear of divine punishment, bad omens, curses, and the mysterious workings of fate. The line between faith and superstition was thin, and royalty walked it every day. To be a king or queen in the Middle Ages wasn't just to wear a crown, it was to carry the belief that God himself had chosen you. This was called the divine right of kings. It meant that disobeying the king wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. The crown wasn't only gold and jewels, it was a symbol of heavenly approval. But that belief came with pressure. If your crops failed, or your armies lost, or lightning struck the palace, everyone whispered that maybe God had changed his mind about you. So monarchs became obsessed with omens, relics, and rituals meant to keep heaven on their side. Let's start with relics. In a world without science as we know it, holiness was believed to have physical weight. Objects touched by saints, a splinter of the true cross, a bone fragment, a drop of holy blood, were thought to carry divine power. Kings collected them like insurance policies. Louis IX of France, for example, spent a fortune acquiring what was believed to be the crown of thorns, the very one worn by Jesus. He built Sainte-Chapelle, a breathtaking Gothic chapel in Paris just to house it. When the relic arrived, the king himself carried it barefoot through the city, wearing a simple tunic to show humility before God. It was one of those rare royal moments that blended genuine faith with sheer theatrical drama. England had its own sacred objects. The coronation regalia, the orb, sceptre, and sword, were infused with religious meaning. The crown itself wasn't just a symbol of rule, it was considered a channel for divine authority. Before each coronation, the new monarch would be anointed with holy oil by a bishop, symbolizing that they were chosen not by men, but by God. And this ritual mattered deeply. When Oliver Cromwell and his parliament executed Charles I in 1649, the act wasn't just political, it was cosmic. Killing a king meant, in their minds, killing the man God had placed above all others. The shock of that act still echoed through England decades later, when Charles II returned and people whispered that divine order had finally been restored. But faith wasn't all ceremony and crowns. It was also fear. The medieval world was terrifyingly uncertain. Disease could strike overnight. Wars began for reasons no one understood. Lightning, comets, and eclipses were seen as messages from above, warnings that God was angry, and so kings prayed. They fasted. They donated gold to monasteries, hoping to earn heavenly favor. When illness struck, they called for relics and priests, not doctors. And when the plague came, that invisible, unstoppable force, even the mightiest rulers felt helpless. King Edward III of England, for instance, watched the Black Death tear through his kingdom in the 14th century. Whole towns vanished, clergymen died faster than they could bury the dead. Chroniclers say the king himself fell into despair, seeing it as punishment for the sins of his people, and perhaps his own. Meanwhile, the French court prayed for deliverance while quietly burning witches and heretics they blamed for the pestilence. When reason fails, fear fills the gap, and fear, in royal courts, often came cloaked in silk. Take astrology. Today we think of horoscopes as light entertainment, but in medieval Europe, astrology was practically state policy. Kings had personal astrologers who charted their birth stars, predicted their reigns, and warned them of dangerous days. Queen Elizabeth I had John Dee, a mathematician, alchemist, and stargazer who helped her choose coronation dates and read celestial signs for political advantage. He also claimed to speak with angels, using a mirror made of obsidian. Whether she believed every word or just found him useful, we'll never know. But Elizabeth's reign was one of the most superstitiously calculated in English history. Across the Channel, Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, kept an astrologer named Nostradamus. Yes, that Nostradamus. The man who wrote cryptic prophecies that people still argue about today. He warned her of threats to her sons and advised her on political timing. When you live in a world of poisonings and coups, it makes sense to trust the stars over your courtiers. Dreams, too, carried meaning. Monarchs often recorded their dreams, believing them to be messages from the divine. A dream of water might predict war. A dream of blood might mean betrayal. It sounds poetic, but in practice, it drove paranoia. King Henry IV of France once dreamed of being stabbed. Days later, he was assassinated in his carriage. That coincidence became legend, convincing future kings that their dreams were sacred warnings. And then there were the so-called royal miracles. In England and France, it was believed that the king could heal diseases with his touch, especially something called the king's evil, or scrofula, a form of tuberculosis. Monarchs would line up the sick, place their hands on their sores and whisper prayers. Chroniclers claimed many were cured. In truth, it was as much about faith as medicine. Even centuries later, King Charles II continued the practice, reportedly touching over 90,000 people during his reign. It was less about healing bodies and more about healing faith, convincing people that the king's hands carried divine grace. But while kings were performing miracles, they were also haunted by curses. The idea of a family curse was deeply rooted in medieval storytelling, from the House of Atreus in Greek myth to the Plantagenets in England. The Plantagenets, for example, were said to be cursed by a monk they'd wronged. King Henry II's family certainly seemed unlucky. Endless rebellions, betrayals and bloody feuds. His sons turned against him, his wife was imprisoned, and his reign ended in misery. The legend of the Angevin curse became a whispered explanation for their endless tragedies. By the time of Richard III, superstition was so ingrained that even the weather at a battle could be seen as a divine sign. At Bosworth Field, where Richard was killed, a sudden rainstorm was said to mark heaven's judgment. All of this paints a picture of royalty not as proud rulers, but as anxious souls trying to make sense of a chaotic world. Their crowns were heavy not just with gold, but with the weight of uncertainty. And that uncertainty often spilled into obsession. Many kings turned to alchemy, the mystical forerunner of chemistry, searching for the philosopher's stone, the mythical substance that could turn metal into gold and grant eternal life. Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire filled his Prague castle with alchemists, astrologers, and mystics. He spent fortunes chasing secrets that never existed. In his twilight years, surrounded by strange machines and glass flasks, he seemed to live more in dreams than in reality. It's easy to laugh now, but imagine being in their shoes. The world felt alive with hidden meaning. Every shadow hinted at divine intent. Every illness felt like punishment. And when your entire right to rule depended on God's favor, superstition wasn't foolish. It was survival. Still, faith wasn't all fear. There were moments of quiet beauty, monks singing in candlelight, queens kneeling at altars, whispering prayers for their children, kings riding at dawn to dedicate new cathedrals. For all their flaws, many medieval monarchs genuinely believed in something greater than themselves. Their world was one of contradiction, power and humility, sin and salvation, cruelty and awe. And that's what makes it strangely human. Strip away the gold and politics, and you find people just as lost, hopeful, and fragile as anyone today. Part 5. Feasts, Food, and the Strange Dining Habits of Medieval Royalty. Boring history for sleep all right. Let's shuffle away from the incense and candlelight and step into something a little noisier. The great feasting halls of medieval Europe. Imagine a space the size of a cathedral, echoing with laughter, music, clinking goblets, and the smell of roasted meat, tapestries on the walls, torches flickering against stone, dogs under the tables, fighting for scraps. This wasn't just dinner, this was theatre. A royal banquet wasn't about eating because you were hungry. It was about showing off wealth, power, refinement, and your ability to have things that peasants couldn't even dream of spelling. So, let's set the table. At the top, of course, sits the monarch on a raised platform called the dais, just high enough to remind everyone who's in charge. The closer your seat to the king or queen, the higher your social rank. The poor souls stuck near the door might as well have been eating in the stables. Plates weren't really plates as we know them. Most people ate off a trencher, basically a thick slab of stale bread that doubled as a plate. By the end of the meal, it soaked up grease and gravy, and you could either eat it or toss it to the servants or dogs. Nothing says luxury like edible tableware. Utensils were minimal. Knives were personal. You brought your own. Forks were controversial. When they first appeared in Europe around the 11th century, people called them sinful and arrogant, as if God had already given humans perfectly good fingers. It took centuries for forks to become normal. Now let's talk about what they actually ate. If you imagine medieval royalty dining on tender steaks and fresh vegetables, well, lower those expectations. Their diets were creative. Meat was everywhere, and not just your typical chicken or beef. Think swan, crane, porpoise, beaver tail, and peacock. Yes, peacock. It was often roasted, then redressed in its own feathers and placed back on the table, tail fanned out like a centerpiece. You weren't supposed to eat it. It was just for show. Medieval cooking loved spectacle. Sometimes they'd sew the heads of different animals onto roasted bodies, like a chicken with a pig's head, just for shock value. Because what's more impressive than culinary taxidermy? Spices were another status symbol. The more exotic, the better. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, all imported from faraway lands at absurd cost. Using them wasn't just about flavor, it was about flexing your wealth. Nobles would literally dump spices onto dishes just to prove they could afford it. Sugar too was a luxury. It wasn't the fine white stuff we know today, more like brownish lumps. Still, it was prized. Cooks sculpted it into castles, animals, or flowers to decorate tables. These subtleties, as they were called, were edible art, meant to impress more than to taste good. And then there was the drink. Water wasn't trusted, not because of some medieval ignorance, but because it was usually filthy. So everyone drank ale, wine, or mead, even children. For breakfast, lunch, dinner, and prayers in between. At big feasts, wine flowed like a biblical miracle. Monarchs often prided themselves on how much they could supply, not how good it was. English kings imported massive barrels from France. Beer and cider filled the gaps for guests of lower rank. Speaking of France, the French courts practically invented culinary fashion. Under kings like Charles V and later François I, food became a kind of diplomacy. Royal chefs were celebrities, constantly inventing new sauces and pastries. In England, things were more hearty. King Henry VIII's feasts were legendary. The man could eat for a small army, Records show his kitchens prepared thousands of meals per day, using dozens of ovens and entire herds of livestock. The Great Kitchen at Hampton Court Palace was like an early industrial food factory, complete with turnspits, bakers, brewers, and butchers. Henry's court consumed about 1,600 sheep, 300 deer, 700 pigs, and 600 oxen per year. Add in the wine, the ale, and the river fish, and you've got a man who clearly believed moderation was for peasants. But beneath the glamour, feasting was also full of weird rules. For instance, in medieval etiquette, it was polite to wipe your hands on the tablecloth, but only between courses. Using your sleeve was seen as vulgar. You also weren't supposed to lick your fingers too much or blow on your food. And you definitely weren't supposed to wipe your knife on your neighbour's bread, though apparently some people did that anyway. Napkins existed, but they were often shared between 2 or 3 people, a nightmare for anyone with boundaries. And the noise. Oh, the noise. Picture minstrels playing lutes, jesters juggling, falcons perched nearby, dogs barking, people shouting for wine refills. Quiet dining wasn't a thing. A royal banquet was chaos dressed up in velvet. Food came in courses, but not like today. Each course might have a dozen dishes at once. Roasted meats, pies, soups, tarts, puddings. Some were savoury, others were sweet. The line between the two was blurry. Meat pies might be sprinkled with sugar, and desserts might include chicken. It was culinary anarchy. And speaking of pies, they loved stuffing surprises inside them. Sometimes it was live birds. You'd cut open the crust, and out they'd fly, to everyone's amusement and probably mild horror. That's where the nursery rhyme, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie, actually comes from. Royal banquets were also about performance. Kings and queens didn't eat much at the main table. They were too busy being watched. Courtiers observed every move, hoping to imitate royal manners. Even taking a bite of food could be a political act. In some courts, the monarch's food was tasted by servants first, to check for poison. Then it was covered, carried on golden dishes, and presented with ceremony. When the king finally took a bite, everyone else followed suit. It was synchronized dining, medieval style. The kitchen staff, meanwhile, worked like medieval magicians. Cooking for a king wasn't just hard labor, it was dangerous. Kitchens were hot, smoky, and full of open flames. People lost eyebrows, fingers, and occasionally lives, but if you did it well, you could rise fast. A good royal chef could become rich, trusted, and sometimes even knighted. Of course, while the nobles dined on peacock and almond pudding, peasants were scraping together porridge, cabbage soup, and stale bread. The contrast was extreme. Royalty literally lived in a different food universe, one that was sugar-coated, spiced, and gilded. Still, even kings had digestive problems. Chronic gout, bloating, and what medieval doctors politely called stomach flux were common. Henry VIII, again, was the poster child for eating himself into misery. Toward the end of his life, he was so overweight that special machines were built to move him, and his legs were covered in ulcers. Medieval medicine, of course, didn't help. They thought indigestion came from imbalanced humours and tried to cure it with leeches or herbal potions. Probably not the ideal fix for 10 courses of venison. Despite all that, food was joy. Banquets marked weddings, coronations, treaties, and victories. They were social glue, a place where politics, gossip, and celebration mixed. And some monarchs took their feasts to ridiculous extremes. Charles VI of France, for example, once hosted a Feast of the Pheasant, a lavish event meant to show off his devotion to crusading. Guests took oaths on a live bird, surrounded by gold tableware and mechanical fountains that spouted wine. It was the kind of event that probably left half the court hungover for a week. Elsewhere, in Burgundy and Italy, nobles competed to see who could throw the most extravagant banquets. Dishes shaped like ships, musicians playing from inside giant pies, fountains made of milk and honey. It was food as performance art. By the Renaissance, the art of feasting evolved into an exact science. There were official masters of ceremonies, professional tasters, and choreographed service routines. But the roots of all that were medieval. Born in smoky kitchens and loud halls where eating was both survival and statement. So, the next time you see a painting of a calm, elegant medieval banquet, just remember, off canvas, there were probably dogs stealing meat, servants panicking, and someone complaining about the lack of cinnamon. In its own chaotic way, that's what made it human. Part 6. Royal marriages and the awkward business of producing heirs. Boring history for sleep all right, so we've left the feasting hall, full of grease, laughter, and mild indigestion. And now we're floating towards somewhere quieter, the royal bedchamber, except of course unquiet is relative, because privacy for medieval royalty was basically a rumour. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about power, political alliances, land deals, and a little something called dynastic survival. Kings didn't marry the person they fancied. They married whoever could bring them a new kingdom, a fleet of ships, or at least a useful treaty. And if you were a royal child, your marriage might be arranged before you even learned how to write your own name. Some princesses were betrothed at age 3, because nothing says romance like a toddler engagement ceremony. Let's start with the big picture. Royal marriages were strategic chess moves. A French princess might be married off to an English prince to stop a war, and 5 years later their kids would start a new one. Alliances were fragile and families were complicated. Everyone was technically related to everyone else, which made weddings feel like very awkward family reunions. In theory, the church required consent for marriage. In practice, no one cared what the bride and groom wanted, especially the bride. A noblewoman's job was simple: marry well, produce heirs, and try not to die in childbirth. Love came later, if ever. Now, if you're picturing a romantic wedding ceremony, think again. Medieval royal weddings were public spectacles, more about politics than sentiment. Guests packed cathedrals. The bride was often a teenager, sometimes much younger. The groom might be decades older. After the vows, things got even more awkward. Because, and this is very medieval, the consummation of royal marriages was sometimes witnessed. Not always directly, thankfully, but symbolically. There'd be a crowd escorting the couple to bed, prayers for fertility, and occasionally courtiers waiting outside the room. The idea was to make sure the marriage was valid in the eyes of God and the state. Imagine your wedding night starting with applause. It was especially awkward if one party wasn't exactly enthusiastic about the arrangement. Poor Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's famously unattractive fourth wife, discovered this the hard way. Henry took one look at her, complained she smelled, and refused to consummate the marriage. He later claimed he was unable, though given his health, that might have been more medical than emotional. Either way, the marriage was annulled within months. Speaking of Henry VIII, he's practically the medieval poster child for marital chaos. 6 wives, 2 beheadings, and one entire religious schism just so he could remarry. It's almost impressive how much personal drama he managed to turn into government policy. His marriages were textbook examples of how love, politics, and ego clashed in royal bedrooms. Catherine of Aragon gave him one surviving daughter, Mary. But he wanted a son, so he married Anne Boleyn, who gave him another daughter, Elizabeth. Still not satisfied, he executed her and moved on to Jane Seymour, who finally bore a son, Edward, but died soon after. The rest is just a blur of annulments, intrigue, and gout. But Henry wasn't alone in this dynastic anxiety. Every royal family obsessed over heirs. Sons meant stability. Daughters meant diplomacy. Queens were essentially expected to function as biological insurance policies. Catherine de' Medici, for example, married King Henry II of France and produced 10 children. She became one of the most powerful women in European history, mostly by sheer endurance. But her pregnancies and family feuds nearly destroyed her health. Then there was poor Isabella of Valois, married off to England's Richard II at age 6. Yes, 6. The marriage was ceremonial until she came of age, but it still made her a pawn in a game she couldn't possibly understand. When Richard was deposed, she was sent back to France, widowed before she even reached adolescence. It's all a little bleak, honestly. Still, there were rare cases of genuine affection. King Edward IV of England, for instance, shocked everyone by secretly marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow with children. The court was scandalized. Marrying for love was basically a career-ending move, but somehow it worked. They stayed together for years, though their children's fates, especially the princes in the tower, didn't end happily. Now, about royal bedroom customs. Medieval people had very specific ideas about fertility. Doctors, who were often just monks with books, gave some wild advice. They said conception was more likely if both partners were warm, calm, and facing north. Also that the moon's phase mattered, and that loud noises during intercourse could disturb the child's spirit. So, yes, a lot of pressure for candlelit silence. The church officially disapproved of passion. Marital sex was considered a duty, not a pleasure. Some theologians even published safe days for intercourse, times when it was morally acceptable. Sundays, holy days, and fasting periods were off limits. Of course, kings ignored that. Most had mistresses, sometimes discreetly, sometimes not. The French and English courts were full of unofficial consorts who wielded serious influence. A clever mistress could outmaneuver half the nobility. Louis XIV of France, though a bit later, basically turned it into a lifestyle. He kept an entire wing of Versailles for his mistresses. Meanwhile, his wife was expected to quietly produce heirs and attend church. It was a very specific kind of royal multitasking. But back in the medieval era, even when kings had legitimate heirs, legitimacy itself could be negotiable. Bastards, as they were bluntly called, were everywhere. Some were ignored, others acknowledged and even given titles. William the Conqueror himself was illegitimate, known as William the Bastard, before he upgraded his resume at Hastings. Legitimacy, love, and power were constantly tangled. A child's birth could secure a dynasty or spark a civil war. The Wars of the Roses, for example, were basically one giant argument over which royal families' children were more official. And through all this, queens carried the heaviest burden. They were expected to be beautiful, virtuous, fertile, and obedient. An impossible checklist. Many died young, worn down by childbirth and politics. Others survived long enough to rule in their own right, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who managed to outwit kings raise armies, and still find time to scandalize Europe. Eleanor is worth pausing on. She married two kings, first Louis VII of France, then Henry II of England, and gave birth to a dynasty that included Richard the Lionheart and King John. She was fiercely intelligent, politically shrewd, and utterly done with men telling her what to do. After divorcing Louis, for being boring basically, she married Henry and helped run an empire. Their marriage was, let's just say, complicated. But Eleanor represents the rare exception, a woman who turned her limited role into authority. Most royal wives weren't so lucky. And yet, behind the stiff portraits and formal marriages, there were real emotions. Letters survive showing tenderness, jealousy, even longing. Kings and queens were, after all, still human, just very constrained ones. Some of them truly did love each other. Others simply tolerated one another in elaborate beds surrounded by attendants, gossip, and embroidered curtains. So when we imagine medieval royalty at night, in their grand four-posters under canopies of velvet, we might picture peace. But in truth, those rooms were battlegrounds for dynasties, filled with the quiet weight of expectation. And tomorrow morning, of course, they'd wake up, attend mass, and pretend everything was fine, because appearances mattered more than happiness. Part 7. The Art of Doing Nothing. Royal Edition. Let's drift over to one of the most underrated royal skills of all time. Doing absolutely nothing. You might think being a medieval monarch meant constant wars, council meetings, and heavy crowns. But in truth, a good chunk of royal life was just boredom in velvet. Take King Henry VI of England. The man was so uninterested in ruling that for long stretches he didn't. He'd just stare off into space while the realm fell apart around him. Imagine the 100 Years' War raging, nobles plotting rebellion, and Henry sitting quietly like, nice window. People said he was saintly, but that was probably just polite code for completely detached from reality. He founded educational institutions, yes, but mostly because governing required too much interaction with actual humans. Eventually, he had a nervous breakdown so deep that he forgot he was king. When told he had a newborn son, he just blinked and asked who the mother was. Meanwhile, over in France, King Charles VI had his own brand of royal weirdness. He went mad and believed he was made of glass. As in, literally. He was terrified someone might shatter him, so he made special rules. No one was allowed to touch him, and he wore reinforced clothing. That's commitment to delusion. You've got to respect the consistency. Court life adjusted, of course. Nobles learned to bow at a safe distance and pretend everything was normal, because in medieval politics, pretending everything was normal was basically half the job. And when rulers weren't mentally checked out, they were spiritually exhausted. Medieval royalty had to project divine purpose, which required a lot of time in church, not necessarily praying, but posing for holy optics. Picture a row of sleepy nobles trying to look pious while thinking about lunch. But not all royal downtime was tragic or tedious. Some monarchs got creative. Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, for example, decided to spend his reign studying falcons and arguing with the Pope. He was fluent in 6 languages, owned a private zoo, and once tried to prove that babies would naturally start speaking Hebrew if no one talked to them. Spoiler, they didn't. The experiment was horrifying, but in Frederick's defense, curiosity was the closest thing he had to a personality. Then there's Philip the Good of Burgundy, a man who threw parties like it was his job. His feasts were legendary. Banquets with peacocks, dancers, and entire indoor rivers made of wine. Historians say he spent so much money on luxury that even his accountants gave up keeping track. He was supposed to be consolidating political power, but clearly, the real goal was to die surrounded by silk cushions and roast swans. The deeper you go into medieval royalty, the more it becomes clear. They were either extremely bored or extremely chaotic, with no middle ground. It's like they were living in a never-ending play where no one remembered their lines, but everyone demanded applause. Even the women of court had their peculiar ways of passing the time. Queen Isabella of France, wife of the perpetually unfaithful Edward II, took up letter writing, diplomacy, and, eventually, open rebellion. You know, hobbies. She helped depose her husband, became regent for her son, and somehow still managed to host fashionable tea hours. That's multitasking on a royal level. In contrast, Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, was the type who refused to be sidelined, while her husband stared blankly at the wall. She ran the kingdom and the wars. She was fierce, smart, and terrifying to her enemies. If Henry was the quiet dreamer, Margaret was the storm that shook the throne awake. It's easy to forget, but much of medieval court life revolved around image maintenance. You had to look rich, act noble, and pretend you weren't slowly losing your mind in a gold cage. Fashion, gossip, and pageantry were the coping mechanisms of the elite. They couldn't go for a walk without a dozen attendants adjusting their robes. There were tournaments, of course, staged displays of manliness where armoured nobles fought for glory, while everyone knew it was mostly theatre. Sometimes they died, but mostly they just showed off expensive armour and ego. Meanwhile, the crowd cheered, the lords bet money, and someone inevitably got hit in the face with a lance. You could say the entire royal system was like an elaborate performance. And the strangest part? Everyone believed in it. From the peasants who prayed for the king's health to the nobles who schemed behind his back. It was a world where divine right met human absurdity, and somehow it all kept spinning. Let's float over now to the next bizarre royal pastime, obsession with legacy. Because when you've already got power, the only thing left to panic about is how history will remember you. Part 8. Legacy, lineage, and a lot of bad decisions. All right, let's settle in and drift deeper into the strange, glittering swamp of royal legacy. If there's one thing medieval monarchs feared more than assassination or plague, it was being forgotten, which is kind of ironic, since most of them ended up remembered for the exact opposite of what they wanted. Legacy was everything. These people were obsessed with leaving behind something monumental. A castle, a dynasty, or at least a flattering tapestry. But more often than not, what they left was a spectacular mess. Take King Charles II of Spain, the poster child for centuries of royal inbreeding. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a wreath. By the time Charles was born, his genes had been recycled so many times that his jaw jutted. His tongue was too large for his mouth, and he struggled to chew or speak properly. He was called the Bewitched, but honestly, it wasn't magic. It was math. Charles never learned to read, had chronic illnesses, and, crucially, couldn't produce an heir. The entire Spanish Empire hung on the fertility of one tragically fragile man. Spoiler, it didn't end well. When he died in 1700, his will sparked a massive European war. Generations of inbreeding had finally collapsed under its own weight. The lesson here: don't marry your niece, or your cousin, or your cousin's cousin. Unfortunately, no one at the time seemed to learn that. Let's drift north to the English royal line again, where Henry VIII was out there redefining bad legacy. The man wanted a son so badly that he broke with the Pope, started his own church, executed 2 wives, and still managed to end up with a daughter who completely overshadowed him. Elizabeth I ruled for decades, never married, and turned England into a global power. Meanwhile, Henry's main contribution to history was being very dramatic. Of course, legacy anxiety wasn't limited to men. Queen Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, yes, the Send Columbus to America duo, were obsessed with uniting Spain under Catholic rule. They succeeded, and then kicked out or forcibly converted Jews and Muslims who had lived there for centuries. It's a dark example of how legacy in royal hands often came at someone else's expense. Then there was poor Mary, Queen of Scots. She had the looks, the charm, the bloodline, and zero luck. Her husbands either died mysteriously, betrayed her, or just turned out to be disasters in human form. She fled to England seeking refuge, only to end up imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth. And after nearly 20 years of cozy captivity, she was executed. Her legacy being the tragic royal everyone felt bad for in hindsight. What's funny is how much energy monarchs put into managing their image, even centuries before social media. They commissioned portraits, staged parades, and wrote letters full of self-praise. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, literally built Versailles as a monument to himself. Every hallway screamed, "Look how magnificent I am." His daily routine was basically a fashion show wrapped in incense and applause. But legacies are tricky. The same Louis who created the golden age of French culture also left his people broke and starving. His great-grandson, Louis XVI, inherited the throne and eventually a guillotine. So much for divine right. Then there's the medieval obsession with bloodlines. Royals genuinely believed that their bodies carried a sacred essence like magical DNA from God. Marrying commoners was considered almost blasphemous. Of course, by keeping the pool small, they guaranteed generations of sickly, short-lived heirs. But, priorities. It's wild to think how much of history hinged on fertility, whether some poor queen could produce a boy before dying in childbirth. Entire wars were started because a baby didn't survive infancy. Divine will was just another way of saying our medical knowledge is terrible. Even architecture played into legacy. Kings wanted monuments that would outlast them, but half the time those projects drained the treasury. Richard II built Westminster Hall's grand hammer beam roof. Still gorgeous, still standing, but he got deposed anyway. Edward I poured his fortune into massive castles in Wales, yet the Welsh kept rebelling. You can build all the stone you want, it doesn't make you immortal. And then you have rulers like Ivan the Terrible. He left behind an empire, sure, but also a legacy of fear, paranoia, and an unfortunate nickname. He killed his own heir during a fit of rage, effectively sabotaging his dynasty, not the kind of brand identity most kings were going for. If medieval monarchs had therapists, history might look very different. Imagine a royal counselor saying, maybe focus on emotional growth instead of conquests. But alas, introspection wasn't really a medieval strength. As we glide toward the later centuries, you start to see the pattern solidify. Power creates paranoia, and paranoia shapes legacy. The more they tried to control how they'd be remembered, the more absurd and tragic their stories became. Because the truth is, the weird life of royalty was never really about ruling. It was about surviving politically, genetically, emotionally, in a world that worshipped them and despised them at the same time. Let's float one last time through the royal corridors in our final stretch. We'll look at what happened when the dream of divine monarchy finally crumbled, and what these centuries of absurd luxury left behind for the world that followed. Part 9. The Fall of Divine Power and the awkward aftermath. All right, still with me. Let's take a slow breath and drift into the late medieval twilight, that long, awkward era when kings started realizing they might not be actual gods after all. It was a rough identity crisis, to put it mildly. For centuries, monarchs had been told they ruled by divine right. God chose you, they said, which was flattering, until plagues, rebellions, and bad harvests started making people question God's taste in leadership. By the 14th and 15th centuries, cracks were showing. The Black Death had wiped out millions. The church was having one of its many meltdowns, and peasants were starting to ask, wait, why are we starving while the king owns 12 palaces? Dangerous question, that one. Revolts started popping up like mushrooms after rain. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was basically a medieval group therapy session gone wrong. People marched on London shouting for freedom, lower taxes and less corruption. King Richard II, who was all of 14 at the time, met them, promised change, and then immediately had their leaders executed. Classic move, still, it planted a seed. Across Europe, monarchs began realizing that divine power might need some rebranding. You couldn't just say, God wants me to rule, anymore without someone asking for receipts. Let's glide over to France for a moment, where the monarchy went all in on being fabulous instead of humble. Louis XV, nicknamed the Spider King, ruled through cunning and manipulation rather than brute force. He spun webs of spies and treaties, keeping enemies tangled until they gave up. It worked for a while, but it also created a kind of royal paranoia that became standard issue for future kings. And then, of course, came the Renaissance, that awkward phase when Europe remembered how to read and promptly decided everything about the Middle Ages was embarrassing. Suddenly kings wanted to be seen as enlightened patrons, not divine warriors. They sponsored artists, philosophers, and mathematicians, mostly to show off how cultured they were. Take Henry VIII again. Yes, the same one who chopped and swapped wives like a bored wedding planner. He branded himself a Renaissance king. Strong, scholarly, musical. And sure, he wrote some hymns and loved a lute, but he also bankrupted England and isolated it religiously. You know, balance. Meanwhile, in France, Francis I was busy hosting Leonardo da Vinci and buying art like he was curating the Louvre, which, to be fair, he kind of was. But behind the velvet curtains, the same old royal weirdness persisted. Illegitimate children, secret affairs, debts, and endless power games. You can polish a crown, but it's still heavy. And yet, amid all this decadence, the cracks deepened. People were reading, thinking, questioning. Printing presses spread new ideas like wildfire. Maybe kings aren't chosen by God, they whispered. Maybe they're just people. A revolutionary thought, really. Then came the Reformation, Europe's spiritual breakup. Suddenly, half the continent was burning each other's churches and arguing over who had the better Bible. Monarchs had to pick sides fast, and many picked poorly. Henry VIII split from Rome. That was just one domino in a centuries-long chain reaction that ended with heads rolling in France. Divine right was looking less divine by the minute. By the 17th century, Europe was filled with kings trying to prove they still mattered. Charles I of England went so far as to start a civil war over it. Spoiler, he lost and got his head cut off in 1649. Which really put a damper on the whole chosen by God argument. France, of course, doubled down, because if England could execute a king, Louis XIV would make sure his monarchy looked unshakable. He turned royal living into performance art. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was propaganda in marble. Everything about it screamed, "Look upon my chandeliers, ye mortals, and despair." And people did, for a while. But beneath the gold leaf, resentment simmered. By the time Louis XV and Marie Antoinette took the stage, it was all over but the shouting. "Let them eat cake," which she probably never said, became the soundbite of a doomed dynasty. The French Revolution wasn't just political, it was psychological. Centuries of divine entitlement crumbled under the weight of bread prices. The guillotine became the great equalizer, and in a way, it was the final chapter of the medieval royal mindset, that belief in bloodlines and celestial privilege. What followed was chaos, naturally. Empires rose and fell like dominoes. Napoleon crowned himself emperor, because apparently we can't not have one, and then fell in spectacular fashion. Monarchs came back, got exiled again, came back again. Europe couldn't quite quit royalty, even when it tried. But something fundamental had shifted. The idea that kings and queens were superhuman beings faded. They became symbols instead of rulers, ornaments instead of overlords. And yet, we still watch them, still gossip about them, still care. Maybe it's nostalgia, or maybe deep down we like the absurdity. The idea that someone out there still lives in a castle and waves from balconies. It's comforting in a strange way, like a fairy tale we all know is fake, but keep rereading anyway. As we float toward the end of our journey, remember this. The weird life of royalty was never about the gold, the crowns, or the divine right. It was about fragile humans trying desperately to look immortal, and failing beautifully. Part 10. Reflections on royal absurdity and the quiet. Aftermath. All right. We're gliding into the final stretch now. Settle in, let your eyes drift, and imagine the faint echo of footsteps in long, empty corridors. This is where we reflect on the odd, extravagant, and quietly tragic lives of royalty. After all the feasts, wars, marriages, and rebellions have passed, one thing becomes clear. Medieval and early modern kings and queens were as human as anyone else, just with more servants, more expectations, and a slightly more permanent sense of being on display. They laughed, they cried, they made terrible decisions, and sometimes they loved. The difference is that their mistakes were usually a matter of national concern. Consider the succession crises. One small health problem, one childless marriage, one bad betrothal could ripple across continents. Wars erupted over the inability to produce an heir. Entire dynasties were threatened because someone sneezed too hard during pregnancy, or because two cousins' offspring had an unfortunate genetic mutation. And yet, life went on. People adapted, survived, and eventually forgot most of the finer details. Except for historians, of course, and us, whispering softly into the void of history today. And then there's the absurdity, the rituals, the fashion, the obsession with legacy, the obsession with appearances. It all looks slightly ridiculous when you step back. Louis XIV strutting through Versailles like a sun god. Henry VIII chopping and swapping wives. Charles VI tiptoeing around in reinforced glass clothing. We can't help but marvel at their commitment to doing everything in style, even when common sense suggested otherwise. And yet, behind the pomp and ceremony, there were real lives. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Margaret of Anjou wielded power with cunning intelligence. Men like Frederick II and Henry VI had their strange hobbies and delicate psyches. Even the tyrants, the famously cruel, often had insecurities, obsessions, and moments of tenderness. Royalty may have seemed larger than life, but it was still life, with all the frustrations, anxieties, and fleeting joys that come with being human. We can float gently over to the castles now. Imagine empty halls, tapestries hanging in silence, and echoes of laughter from centuries past. The kings and queens who once paced these corridors, debated in councils, or hid in bedchambers with a mixture of fear and boredom are gone. Their crowns are empty, their thrones dusted over. All that remains are the traces, the buildings, the art, the letters, and of course, the stories. And what do those stories tell us? They tell us that being royal is a very particular form of weirdness, a combination of privilege, pressure, and absurdity that few could survive unscathed. They remind us that history is full of humans, struggling, scheming, loving, and failing, just with a few more velvet cushions and a bit more gold. So as we let our minds drift, remember the faces behind the crowns, the anxious parents, the bored teenagers, the scheming consorts, the exhausted monarchs. Each life a delicate balancing act between survival, ambition, and the strange, quiet desire to be remembered. Some succeeded, many failed, and a few just drifted off quietly, leaving the world to puzzle over their legacy. And now, as the lights dim and the corridors of history fade into shadows, we can finally rest. Royalty, for all its extravagance, all its power struggles and all its absurdity, was ultimately human. And that is perhaps the most comforting, sleep-inducing thought of all. Good night.